Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Steve Mueller. I'm the Dean of Christ College. I want to welcome you to the 15th Annual Harry and Caroline Trembath Lecture in Confessional Theology. Trembaths established this rotating theological professorship in 2002 as part of their estate plan. Committed Lutheran Christians, they wanted to support advanced theological research that was faithful to their confession and done for the sake of the church. One way they sought to do that was to stipulate that the Trembath professor give a public lecture each year, typically the year after he's had his research leave. Most endowed professorships are assigned to a particular faculty member who permanently holds the chair. The Trembath chair, which is Concordia's first endowed professorship, was set up to rotate among senior theological faculty who have a strong research proposal. That decision has made this a very productive chair. Past holders have published numerous books and articles supported in part by the Trembath professorship. Any of you who've had core theology or Christian doctrine here have seen some of the fruits of that. In addition to this afternoon's speaker, we're happy to acknowledge Dr. Joel Esch in the back, who's currently holds the Trembath professorship. We'll be inviting you to return next spring for his Trembath lecture. It's still in the works. He's deep in his research right now. Concordia University's Christ College expresses our gratitude to the Harry and Caroline Trembath Endowment for supporting this ongoing work. And now this afternoon's speaker is Dr. David Rueter. Dr. Rueter is a graduate of Concordia University, Irvine, Trinity International University, and Biola University's Talbot School of Theology, where he earned his PhD in Christian education. He has served as Director of Christian Education in Austin, Texas, Huntington Beach, California, and Rancho Cucamonga, California. Since 2011, Dave has served in a joint position. He is the Youth and Family Ministry Facilitator for the Pacific Southwest District of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and Professor of Christian Education and Director of the DCE program at Concordia University, Irvine. Dr. Rueter is known for his research on the Lutheran practice of confirmation and catechesis. His publications include an acclaimed book, Teaching the Faith at Home. What does this mean? How is this done? Dr. Rueter's Trembath research studied the relationship between ordained and commissioned ministry in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Built on the foundation of biblical theology, seen in the context of historical development, his work explores practical implications of a more fully formed theology of commissioned ministry. I am very thankful that Dr. Rueter has taken on this important topic, which has already been a blessing to the church, to commissioned ministers, and to pastors. One note about this afternoon's presentation. We are recording to share with others. There are going to be 2 short breaks that are simply to give a break in the video production. So hold tight and we'll keep moving along very shortly. And with that, I give you Dr. Dave Rueter.
Thank you, Steve. Part 1, I want to tackle the question of who are commissioned ministers. If we're going to have a conversation at all with regard to how they relate to the office of public ministry, we ought to at least cover a really basic thumbnail. Who are we? I believe I may be the first commissioned minister, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, to hold this chair. And hooray, Joel gets to be the second following. But we want to start by identifying, well, who are they? And then have a conversation focusing on how helping offices, which is another term that gets used for commissioned ministers, a more historic term, how they show up in the writings of the early Lutheran fathers. So who are commissioned ministers? Well, from the beginning, the LCMS has been served by both pastors and Lutheran teachers. With the growth of the LCMS in the 20th century, we've seen the addition of a number of rostered positions known now as commissioned ministers. So you have included in this directors of Christian education, directors of Christian outreach, deaconesses, directors of parish music, director of family life ministry, and the certified lay minister. Now, an interesting historical note is to think in terms that at the beginning, at the founding of our synod, In 1847, we had 12 churches. We also had 14 schools. Do the fun math there. In 1872, there were 446 churches, 472 schools. Again, we're doing the math, and something is outgrowing the other. There was a tendency at that time historically to plant the school before planting the church. There were cultural reasons for this, in the preserving of the German and Lutheran heritage of the immigrants that were coming to our country, but there was also this emphasis on quality Lutheran Christian education. So stepping from kind of where we are today, we need to jump back quite a ways, and what an appropriate place to jump. Let's jump all the way back to Luther. Probably wouldn't be appropriate to jump anywhere else at this moment. To understand what it means today when we talk about the office of public ministry, it is important to consider how ministry was understood in the writings of our Lutheran forebears. For it is upon the foundation that they laid that the interpretive framework that is Lutheranism has been established. It is critical to get a handle on how Luther, Chemnitz, and others approach the text of Scripture in order to articulate a doctrine of the office of public ministry. Luther is a puzzle. Back up here. Keep the puzzle up there. Luther is a puzzle when it comes to trying to put together a picture of his view on the office of public ministry. Avoiding a hierarchical structure typical to his style, Luther is not motivated to attempt to solidify his view of ministry into a specific doctrinal statement. We sometimes talk about Luther as an occasional theologian. He responds to the occasion that presents itself. He did not sit down and say, I'm going to write a systematic theology, therefore you cannot grab a Luther systematic theology and say, all right, where does he reference the office of public ministry? It doesn't occur in that form. This has allowed for an element of ambiguity to remain in the articulation of Lutheran theology in the writings of generations of theological followers of Luther. More so, this has left possible the lack of clarity has faced by those in auxiliary offices today. Klug explains how Luther understood the necessity for additional help for the local pastor in his ministry in cases where the congregation he is ministering to is large. Klug states, in a busy and large parish, it might be necessary, Luther stated in a 1525 sermon, to divide it into 4 or 5 geographic parts, with various helpers assigned to assist the pastor in ministering to the souls and bodily needs of the parishioners. The primary responsibility, especially for spiritual care, would reside in the called pastor. But we know from the New Testament example, said Luther, that other helpers may be necessary so that no one in the parish is neglected, body or soul. Such individuals could rightly bear the name deacon or deaconess. In the context of 16th century Germany, this may have been a reference to the ministerial assistance provided by deacons and subdeacons as they are referenced in some of the texts. Though there is a question as to whether the deacon was given license to preach or merely to care for the souls of the community. In his 1523 work, that a Christian assembly or congregation has the right and power to judge all teaching and to call, yes, that's the entire title. Oh, excuse me, that's not the entire title. And dismiss teachers. The title just kept going. Luther discusses what he refers to as lower offices, stating, therefore, whoever has the office of preaching imposed on him, interesting language, imposed on him, has the highest office in Christendom, imposed on him. Again, there's an emphasis here. Afterward, he may also baptize, celebrate Mass, exercise all pastoral care, or if he does not wish to do so, he may confine himself to preaching and leave baptizing and other lower offices to others, as Christ and all the apostles did. Acts 4. It is interesting that in this early work of Luther's, he seems to allow for a rather flexible approach to handling the work of pastoral ministry. While no one would argue that those who have not been called to preach as pastors to a local congregation should not presume to do so, it seems that Luther was open to the local pastor allowing for those in lower offices to handle other elements of ministry, such as baptism. While it is less clear if Luther here is assuming all such lower offices to be merely what we might term as assistant or associate pastors, how this is understood by subsequent Lutheran theologians may, as we progress, shed light on Luther's own understanding. Moving to Martin Chemnitz, second Martin. Known as the second Martin, Chemnitz is credited by many as having preserved the original theology of Luther from the influence of the so-called crypto-Calvinists, which if you were here for the lecture last year, you heard a little bit about. He was a key theologian and pastor during the second generation of the Reformation. And through his many theological writings and his contribution to the Formula of Concord, brought into clearer focus the teachings that Luther had risked so much during the prior generation. Klug again states, on the basis of New Testament teaching and examples, Martin Chemnitz subscribes fully to the position which Luther has articulated concerning the pastoral ministry as the highest and fundamental office ordained by God, and the auxiliary offices arising from the need in the church for additional help. We're already starting to see a pattern. Consistent with his larger work, solidifying the theological work of Luther, Klug notes that Chemnitz was in agreement with Luther on how to understand the office of public ministry. Again, we see an emphasis on the pastoral office along with the assisting ministries of the auxiliary offices. Chemnitz offers a rather pragmatic explanation of the necessity in some situations for the pastor to be assisted in fulfilling his office by others. Stating it this way, in fact, the fact of the matter is this, because many duties belong to the ministry of the church which cannot all conveniently be performed by one person or by a few, when the believers are very numerous, in order therefore that all things may be done in an orderly way, decently, and for the edification, these duties of the ministry began as an assembly of the church, grew great to be distributed among certain ranks of ministers, which they afterward calls taxis, ranks. Apologies for linguists in the room. I am not one of you. I'm just going to own that one now, so if you're critiquing that end of it, just bear with me. So that each might have, as it were, a certain designated station in which he might serve the church in certain duties of the ministry. Notice that not only does Chemnitz point out the necessity for assistance for the work of the pastor, but he refers to the work as duties of the ministry. He goes on to stress that the welfare of the assembly of the church and the individual duties which belong to the ministry might be attended to more conveniently, rightly, diligently, and orderly I must have left them out. Apologies. And orderly, with a measure of dignity and for edification, as the rationale for the introduction of such orders or ranks. He points back to the apostles as having begun this necessary division of ministers. There is no dismissive attempt to distinguish between the true ministry and supporting ministry through other work. In other words, waiting tables. There is occasion in some theological writings to try to parse those two apart, and we'll continue to discuss that a bit as we go. Rather, Chemnitz seems comfortable discussing the need for these additional ranks of ministers rightly as ministers in their own right. Chemnitz stresses that there is no command in God's word for these orders. There is not a specific list or required number or type. They are to be established for the sake of good order, decorum, and edification for the church. These ranks were not something besides and beyond the ministry of the word and sacraments, but the real and true duties of the ministry, were distributed among certain ranks for the reasons already set forth, Chemnitz states. For Chemnitz, the need for these additional ranks was based on the size of the local congregation and the need of that congregation that could not be adequately cared for by a single pastor. Whether these additional ranks included the need for additional pastoral ministry or ranks focused on specific needs within the general pastoral care of the faithful. The local church had Christian freedom to engage these servants in the ministry of the church. Johann Gerhard. No pressure that we have a Gerhard scholar sitting in the back of the room. Be gentle. Prolific in his writing, Johann Gerhard's theological commonplaces are currently becoming far more accessible to the English-speaking world. What does this theologian of Lutheranism's age of orthodoxy have to offer in this discussion of the office of public ministry? Klug states that Gerhard chimes in with Chemnitz, that ranks or orders among the clergy do not rest on the authority of God's word, nor on the apostolic precedent. In his work on ecclesiastical ministry, Gerhard discusses the work of deacons, especially as described by Paul in Romans, stating it this way. Second, interesting that I start a quote with second, but we'll go with it. Second, it is attributed to the ecclesiastical order, and this again in different ways. A, preeminently, it is attributed to Christ, who is the chief shepherd and by his own ministry on earth has consecrated and sanctified the ecclesiastical ministry. B, in a more general sense, it is attributed to all ministers of the church who serve God and the church by teaching, administering the sacraments, and performing other duties of the ecclesiastical ministry. And C, in a more specific sense, it is taken to mean those who were occupied chiefly with that duty of ecclesiastical ministry that involves food and distribution of necessities. Here it should be noted that Gerhard appears to include the ministry of deacons along with other ecclesiastical offices as properly ministries of the church. The source of all ministry is the authority of Christ. Gerhard refers to Christ as our chief shepherd. Within the context of the local church, the pastor serves as the under-shepherd in the stead and by the command of Christ. Those in auxiliary offices serve under the ministry of these under-shepherds placed there by the local congregation. Gerhard further explains, but in those deacons were commissioned, but in the end, those deacons were commissioned also with the ordinary duty of teaching, from which also those whom Act 6 mentions were not simply excluded, though they were chiefly in charge of the tables, so that they joined to the presbyters, preached the word together with them, administered the sacraments, visited the sick. In this way, they were made teachers of a lower order in the church. If this is an indication of a separate commissioning to teach, which may be a right understanding, what then is made by their being teachers of a lower order? It might be that Gerhard is here indicating a similar status as we might see in our modern nomenclature of assistant or associate pastor. However, is this the only possible meaning behind his words? Might it be that these deacons, being ordained as pastors before they were able to carry out the teaching ministry of the church, that instead of this, further entrusted to fulfill additional functions of the office of public ministry, which was not entrusted to them previously. So the tension here is, are they being entrusted in something more fully, or is this a part of the assumption of which they are already given their role to serve in the church? This latter interpretation of Gerhard can be supported by his own words later in the same book, when he states that it is false to say that the deacons had been put in charge merely of tables. For we have shown earlier from the example of Stephen and Philip that they too performed the teaching ministry. Further, in the second volume of his work on ecclesiastical ministry, Gerhard notes that there are two kinds of deacons, so-called from ministering. Some were in charge of the care of the poor and management of the church property. One, on the other hand, some had been joined to the bishops or presbyters in the office of teaching and administering the sacraments in order to take their place and alleviate their labors. So we are continuing to see delineations and ways in which we are taking this singular office of public ministry and, based on needs, responding and separating out in order to handle what is the ministry before us. Here we see Gerhard distinguishing between two kinds of deacons. Not all deacons were called to teach or administer the sacraments. This speaks to the church's use of Christian liberty to call ministers to various kinds of roles of ministry. Yet, how are we to understand deacons who administer the sacraments? Does this not imply that deacons would have been ordained, or at least understood as ordained pastors are today, rather than commissioned ministers? While it may be that this argues for the ordination of deacons, it may not be that this is a necessary conclusion. On this specific count, the role of the deacon does seem more akin to an associate or assistant pastor. However, the larger discussion of their duties seems more naturally to imply a more distinct office, which supports the office of public ministry by administering the sacraments on his behalf and under his authority. This, to some degree, would be similar in line of reasoning, support modern-day elders bringing the Lord's Supper to the elderly and the sick on behalf of their pastor. Summary for Part 1. Our Lutheran forebears held a very high view of the office of public ministry. That ought not to be lost in any discussions on the current nature of that office. Luther sought to restore the role of the pastor from the priestly morass of medieval Romanism. That was the context in which much of his writings on the subject took place. Yet at the same time, in these writings of the Lutheran theologians, one is able to discern not merely a high view of ministry of the pastor, but the freedom of the church to augment this ministry as the early church did when deacons were established. There is a place in their thinking not only for the ministry of the pastor, but for the participation of other servants of the word. This does not yet answer the question specifically related to the place of commissioned ministers in relation to the office of public ministry. To move closer to our contemporary situation, the next portion of the lecture will turn to C.F.W. Walther and his conception of the ministry formed during the tumultuous time leading up to the founding of the LCMS.